So what is community use planning? All it is the planning and management. It's a process for determining the most appropriate land uses for specific areas. And when you do it, you want to designate these lands not just for now, but for the future land uses. And this helps support sustainability. And it also determines who is allowed to use the lands. In other words, if you start planning out the reserve, what's best for your people, you would identify like your own housing subdivisions. And that means then only your members would live in that area. The overall goal is to reach sustainability. And it's difficult to do because we don't have a lot of land. However, it's possible. First Nations had many traditional ways of living on the lands, and then reserves were created. So that's how we ended up with small portions of land. And unfortunately, the way things went, many of us lost the concept of communal ownership. And I know in a lot of the smaller reserves, people got fences up everywhere to make sure they get their little piece of the pie. And it gets difficult in some reserves where there's like only 400 acres or something, and they have large populations. The creation of artificial boundaries requires sensitivity in neighborhood municipalities, such things as a river or a lake that may determine the boundary. Then your actual land will increase or decrease periodically. Like on riverbanks, especially if it's still river, or the ocean, where you have soils that are falling into the water or some that are building up. So it's never a definite boundary. Good community use planning uses the sustainable development model. Now this, I'm being sarcastic here, because this is what they used to think were the three major components of sustainable development: environment, economy, or economic and social. But they miss one big thing, and that was culture. And it doesn't matter if you're Aboriginal or non-Aboriginal, depending where you go, there's the culture that dominates the way people live, because that is who they are. So really, there's four. Culture is huge. The community use plan should consider the people, number one, the well-being of your people, and the use and development of the land over the long term for the benefit of the people. Now sometimes some First Nations, the benefit to their people may be agriculture, whereas others may be economic development in industry, or it may just be developing homes for the people. Community centers, public buildings, whatever it is, it's specific to your people here in Membertou. And unfortunately, we have guidelines to help us do it, but there's no cookie cutter way of doing it. There's no one set of rules and this is what you do. They're all just kind of guidelines, because you have to take into consideration the people themselves, what they want, the way you do things. Also, each First Nation is so unique from the other. Like models that may work in Alberta might not work in Ontario. So the difference can be large. Sustainable development can be defined as development which balances the four components of economic, social, environmental, and cultural. Only when the four components are in harmony, a development can be said to be sustainable. So some of your considerations for social are how the community works together. Here in Membertou, I find the community work very well together. I was very impressed on the way the people embrace what's going on and make it their business. The caring for your elders, the overall quality of life, the level of crime, availability of recreational facilities and programming, and your overall respect for the land, the community, and the environment. That's kind of your outline for what we mean as social. For economic, it will consider things like your cost of living or wages, the variety of employment opportunities that are available on your First Nation or nearby, revenues generated by resources that could be leasing or any other kind of source, all your capital costs required to keep the community viable, like your infrastructure costs, roads, bridges, and any economic decisions made must take into consideration the social and environmental considerations because it will impact them greatly. On the environmental side, it's things like your biophysical health. That's just the balance of the environment itself in the sense of health, healthy community. Protections of sacred or traditional areas. Do you have potable water? Collection and treatment of any sanitary sewer systems. Your stormwater management and mapping of your floodplains and aqueducts. The management of solid waste. The stewardship of the land. The accountability of decision makers. And conservation and protection of natural resources. So that kind of groups what the environmental side is. And your cultural and traditional side, some things are tangible, some things are not. You're just taught them. It embodies many socio-cultural, economic, and environmental dimensions of a community, and it reflects and enable community relationships for accomplishments, challenges, and hopes or resources to draw upon, and tools for action. Cultures and tradition, really, you would write your own section for this, whatever would drive your community for culture. And your key culture elements in the community can be used as anchors for creating policy in your overall planning. For instance, there are places perhaps in your First Nation where you would never think of building. They could be a sacred site or there's something significant about them, which wouldn't necessarily be written down. But that's where the culture aspect and communicating helps so that you ensure that those sites are protected. A basic step in community cultural planning and policy making is identify the community's key cultural elements and integrating the knowledge into broader context. This way, it also acts as a learning process, especially when it's exposed to the younger children, like in your preschools and kindergartens and your early elementary grades. Concerns for sustainability adds longer-term considerations and reflections to this work. And remember, when you're doing this work, it never ends. It's a living document. It will continue to evolve. Now, here's my attempt. And all I'm doing is taking the 4 circles, social, economic, environmental, and cultural, and you bring them all together, and as soon as they evenly overlap, what's that in the middle is your sustainable development model. It's to try to get the balance. And that way it helps ensure that you've looked after all aspects of your community, not just the land and land management or economic development, but the people themselves and your future generations. Okay, why do we manage? Well, land, of course, is so valuable and scarce that if we don't manage it properly, we're going to lose it. Not in the sense someone's going to take it away, but it's not going to be usable. we have fewer resources and fewer options for the people in the future. This happened specifically where this sunk home for me is when I saw the strip mining in Ontario. That, of course, took place decades and decades ago, but that land, I have no idea if or when they'll ever be able to use it again. First Nations, while working within a larger ecosystem, are actually working within a closed system. It's important for First Nations to manage their lands as in a responsible custodial manner, because it's the only land we have. And unless some nations, such as the TLE nations, Treaty Land Entitlement Nations, many of us are tied up in specific claims or comprehensive claims that will go through generations before we get a result. So if we can get a handle on it now, we have a better life for our future generations. First Nation peoples, as we talked about last time, are the fastest growing demographic there are in Canada. And a lot of our young people, they go to school and then they come home and with an education to apply it. And yet when they come home, many people don't understand that there's not much to go home to in a lot of our reserves. They're usually very remote. Unemployment is over 50% because of their locations. And it puts a lot of stress and pressure on the community as a whole, because no one feels good when their kids come home and there's no jobs, there's no housing, in some cases there's no clean water. So it makes it very hard for some First Nations, and planning should be part of their agenda to help and get something going for the future, for the people coming, the kids coming home now, and then their children who are yet to come. Most First Nations are experiencing these growths in pressure as well as population, and with new demands for resources and increasing demands on services and, of course, infrastructure. And the desire by First Nations to take more control over their lands makes it mandatory for First Nations to properly manage their lands. So what you end up with, you get stewardship and steward, you get the custodial aspect of it. It's just the practice of carefully managing land use to ensure natural systems are maintained or enhanced for future generations. So that's kind of the outline of what the overall community planning is. It's not just planning for the land, it's planning for everything. And it's usually done in components, like each area within the First Nation would take on some kind of role to help develop it by working with the community. And then at the end of the day, you have a full comprehensive community use plan. Within that would be a land use plan. It just forms one part of your overall community use plan. Now, there are some very good models of how to do community use plans that were developed as projects with a number of First Nations. If you want to have a look at it or find it yourself and read it, it's very useful and very helpful if you're going to get into community use planning. I actually use it in the classroom now. There's two models, one of which is far more superior than the other. But it's really a good guide if this committee wants to start looking at it and providing recommendations. This is a big component, especially because you have the city right here, is your land use planning. And once you start the consultation process under the duty to consult, is you may be able, or you should be able, to work with the city, because where it's important for the First Nations, especially where infrastructure is coming in and out of, you want to make sure it's planned so that if the First Nation wants to add to it or upgrade, that the city's infrastructure is running copacetic with yours, or vice versa. And that's just a matter of negotiating it out and making a stand that you are part of the planning process. So in this case, this is the most honest, true definition I could come up with. And this was actually out of the Municipality Act of Alberta of what land use planning is. And it's a mouthful, but I don't know how else to explain it, to give a concept of just that component of planning. So the land use planning is the process of planning the scientific, orderly allocation of land, community resources, facilities and services with a view to maintaining and improving the physical environment and economic and social conditions of urban and rural communities.
So help us God.
Yeah. That is the broadest but yet most defined. I know that's an oxymoron, but it kind of encompassed everything broadly, but it actually brought it right back to the target. Now, if somebody wants to work on a better one for me, please do. I was getting so confused how do you teach someone the definition of land use planning? We all have our own vision of it, and it all in somewhat contains all those elements. Anyhow, I almost wanted to laugh when I saw it because it was so cumbersome. Okay, land use or community planning has historically been funded by the federal government. And what happens is, has not been funded. It is not a fiduciary duty for them. It isn't. And again, what happened was with the division of powers coming from the Constitution. And the provinces then delegated the responsibility down to municipalities. But remember the Constitution, Section 92, the provincial powers, it's in 92 where it says that provinces may create municipalities. They didn't have to, but they did. And while they did that, then they just delegated that authority down to that particular municipality. So the planning is based on long-term goal setting and achieving these goals in the best interest of the greater population, of course. And while the land was within municipalities, it's not looked at as communal land like we do in First Nations. So they had their idea that there was more individual rights rather than communal rights. So even their whole model of planning, land use planning and community use planning is based on totally different principles than how many of us base it on. The land use planning usually starts with your vision of the community. Now, I know Member 2 has a plan. I've read something about the plan, and are you in the process of updating it again? Because, like I was saying earlier, you create a plan, it's a living document. You constantly have to work on it and update it, whether it's a community use plan or a land use plan. It uses a comprehensive public process. So, like committees like this, public meetings, community meetings, so that people are aware and can voice their opinion. And it's essential that membership is involved in whatever way. I don't know if I told you this the last time, or I just told maybe the class here, but I did this little group session in our community when I was the director of lands there, and I got maps, just plain reference maps, and we had community dinner, and everybody was seated like by the main family groups, and they all had crayons, and they all had this great big map, and their family each described by coloring what they wanted to go where. And you know the amazing part of it? There was hardly any difference from one family to the other, because everyone knew the reserve very well and thought of it collectively for everyone. And that's just one we use to get started. Of course, you guys are beyond that now because you're already updating what you have. So whatever method you take to go to the community, this committee is always relevant with the feedback you get back. And then it's guided and everyone knows why things are where they are. While it may have some modifications depending on the process you use, the basic comprehensive planning process actually only has 4 steps to it. Your first one is your vision, your second one is the research, the third is actually preparing the plan, the fourth is the plan itself. But I'm going to add a fifth, and I think the fifth is one of the most important ones, is who's managing the plan. Somebody has to manage the plan, because that's what I see falls down so many times. No one really holds that responsibility. Elections take place, people change employment, and then you have this beautiful plan that's out of date because it's not living anymore. So I think there's actually 5. Membership has to be involved at every step. There has to be proper consultation within your community. The final land use plan document has to be membership driven. And if it's not, you won't have a very good plan. People won't buy into the plan. They'll resist it. And I mean, it's almost human nature, but also practically, if all of a sudden council said, well, we're doing this, this, and this, and the community didn't know about it, there would be immediate resistance. Because why didn't you consult? Or why wasn't the staff or this committee out there, with the booths and things like that, communicating with the membership? But if they know, they can also help you decide on things that maybe you weren't sure of, or help you, this committee, come up with some recommendations. Now, I won't go through all this individually. This is really what I've done. You'll have it on your slides. I broke it down onto what each one of these steps do, like basically how to do it. But I think it's more, that's just the guideline. So whatever planning process you decide, it's there as a model. Plus I'll send the large, it's actually a manual. I'll send that. And then you guys develop your own when you're beginning planning sessions of whatever kind of planning you do. The principles are basically the same to drive it.